Shawnees in the War for America by Colin G. Calloway. The travails of Cornstalk continued. Many Virginians had been waiting for a chance like this. The Virginians are vicious, ferocious. The Shawnees hated the fucking Virginians. And the Virginians, who are the Virginians, if we can remember? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry. So the Virginians really wanted to kill the Shawnee. So, in a circular letter calling for volunteers, Colonel William Preston urged men to turn out and defend their lives and property. We may perhaps never have been so fair an opportunity of reducing our old, inveterate enemies to reason, he said. It will be the only method of settling at last pace with all the Indian tribes around us who on former occasions have been urged by the Shawnees to engage in a war with Virginia. At last in pace, that's what he spelled it as, but he meant peace. This useless people may now at last be obliged to abandon their country. Their towns may be plundered and burned, their cornfields destroyed, and they distressed in such a manner as will prevent them from giving us any future trouble. There are other incentives as well. There'd be valuable plunder. It said that the Shawnees have a great stock of horses. For their part, the Shawnees distinguish between Pennsylvanians and Virginians. The Pennsylvanians, they want to rob, but the Virginians, they want to kill. In August, Major Angus MacDonald, a veteran of both the 1745 Jacobite rebellion in Scotland and the French Indian War in America, led an expedition against the Shawnee towns in the upper Muskingum River. That's Angus MacDonald. So Major Angus MacDonald, the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland. So he was a Scottish man. He led an expedition against the Shawnee towns in the upper Muskingum River. The Virginians burned cabins and cornfields, killed several people, and they took 3 scalps and 1 prisoner, but this was only a prelude to the main campaign. While Governor Dunmore led one army of 1,500 men down the Ohio from Fort Pitt, General Andrew Lewis led another force of about 1,100 down the Kanawha River. They intended to rendezvous, cross the Ohio, and launch a combined assault on the Shawnee village on the Scioto River. Chief Cornstalk. So enter Chief Cornstalk. Reputedly urged his warriors to seek peace, and on the evening before the battle offered to go and talk with the Virginians, but the Shawnees would not listen to him. So Chief Cornstalk and his war chiefs Black Hoof, Black Fish, Blue Jacket, and Puckashinwa, who was Tecumseh's daddy. So Chief Cornstalk fought with Tecumseh's daddy, Puckashinwa. So that's an Algonquin round table out there. You know, you got Black Hoof, Black Fish, Blue Jacket, Puckashinwa. That's some major players in the Indian caucuses. So Cornstalk with his war chiefs, Black Hoof, who later on was born in the Skippakitki, and he would be a person who would sell out. Black Fish took over for Cornstalk. Blue Jacket was an incredible Shawnee chief. So, okay, together with some Mingo and other allies, they were able to muster no more than 700 men. So these great Indian war chiefs got 700 men, hopelessly outnumbered. They pinned their hopes on being able to defeat one of the advancing armies before they joined the forces. Crossing the Ohio by rafts that night, the Shawnees attacked Lewis's army at sunrise on October 10th at a place called Point Pleasant. By sunset, the forest floor was as red as the leaves on the trees. Shawnees and Virginians agreed that it was a hard-fought and desperate battle. At first, the Shawnees pushed the Virginians back. Then Virginian reinforcements arrived, and the Shawnees in turn had to retreat until they formed a line behind logs and trees from the bank of the Ohio to the bank of the Kanawha River. Colonel William Christian said that, urged on by their chiefs, the Shawnees fought with bravery that exceeded every man's expectations. Colonel Charles Stewart, who fought in the battle, credited Cornstalk with great military skill. He recalled, "I could hear him the whole day speaking very loud to his men, and one of my company, who had once been a prisoner, told me what he was saying, encouraging the Indians, telling them to be strong, be strong." But the Indians began to run out of powder and shot, and sheer weight of numbers made it a lost cause. Towards sundown, Chief Cornstalk began to withdraw his exhausted warriors across the Ohio River. The Virginians suffered 75 killed, including Charles Lewis. the general's brother, and 140 wounded. When they walked over to the battlefield the next morning, they counted 20 Indian dead on the ground and scalped the bodies. So they killed 75 Virginians, including Charles Lewis, the general's brother, and they wounded 140. When they walked on the battlefield, they said that there's 20 Indian dead on the ground. Later, found a dozen more concealed in another place. The Indians said Stuart confessed that they'd thrown a number into the river in time of the battle, so it's possible that the slain on both sides were about equal. Mass horseshit. 20 Indians dead versus 75. The Shawnee won that first battle, Point Pleasant. John Norton, who spoke with Shawnees early in the 19th century, said that they suffered about 30 men killed and lost the pouch which contained the war charm. Several white Shawnees fought against the Virginians at Point Pleasant. So there was several Simon Girty's before Simon Girty. I think Simon Girty might have been with the Virginians at this point. So the white Shawnees, you got George Collett, Collett, George Collett, John Ward, Taverner Ross, like governor, but Taverner, like tavern, like a bar. Taverner Ross were in the Shawnee Rakes. So those are interesting. George Collett, John Ward, and Taverner Ross. Collett was heard exhorting the Indians to fight on against the white damned sons of bitches. After the battle, his body was found among the Indian dead. So Collett died. George Collett died for the Shawnee cause. That's one good white person. That's one good. Some of the Europeans actually were good people. They fought for the right side in terms of morality. This was the Indian land. This was not the Europeans' lands. It was the Indians. The Indians were here over 30,000 years, and there's 100 million of them all across North America, and they were wiped out. So George Collett died in the first battle of Point Pleasant. His brother, who's in the Virginian Army, identified his body. John Ward's natural father, also in the Virginian Army, was killed in the battle. Ward himself survived. In 1792, he fought in a skirmish with the Party Kentucky militia that included his brother. A year later, he was mortally wounded in a clash where another brother fought on the opposing side. So the Civil War was known as brother versus brother, but really the Revolutionary War was brother versus brother, especially on the frontier end, on the side where they was fighting against the Indians, where there were the English versus the colonialists was less of a concern, whereas it was more against the Indians in Kentucky. So Taverner Ross, on the other hand, eventually left his Shawnee relatives and he returned to live in the American settlements. Colonel Stuart may have inflated the Shawnee losses, but forcing the Shawnees from the field constituted victory enough. Lewis's army consisted mainly of young volunteers, but despite having sustained more than 20% casualties, they crossed the river eagerly, bent on destroying the enemy. Had they not been restrained by the governor's orders, Stuart believed they would have been exterminated. They would have exterminated the Shawnee nation. Constalk returned to the Shawnee towns and called a council to consult on what to do next. He upbraided the Shawnees for not letting him make peace the evening before the battle. Now the big knives were advancing on their homes. He said, "Let us all kill our women and children, and then we will go and we will fight till we die." And then nobody responded. Constalk got up, struck his tomahawk in the post at the center of the council house, and announced he would go and make peace. Rather than deal with Lewis and his vengeful army, he chose to meet with Governor Dunmore at Camp Charlotte. Matthew Elliott, an Irishman who had fought against the Shawnees at Bushy Run, but who had been trading with them for the past 9 years and had earned their confidence, agreed to carry the message to Dunmore. So peace, Dunmore. So Dunmore is the British government. So this is the British coming in and killing all these Indians. The British and the colonialists were in, on the same front when it came to killing the Shawnees. Peace proved expensive. Dunmore demanded that the Shawnees give up their land south of the Ohio and send 4 hostages to Williamsburg as a guarantee of future conduct. One of the hostages was Constalk's son, Wissey Capaway. A young Englishman who saw them on their way to Williamsburg described the hostages as tall, manly, well-shaped men of a copper color with black hair, quick, piercing eyes, and good features. Their heads were shaved except for a long scalp lock, and their faces painted with vermilion. They had silver rings in their noses, and the tops of their ears were slit and extended with brass wire so that they hung down and touched their shoulders. They wore white men's clothing except breeches, which they refused to wear, preferring their traditional loin cloths. Chief Cornstalk endeavored to keep the peace he had made, and some Shawnees became reconciled to the loss of their lands south of the Ohio. Others never did. A chief named Kishkawa, who fought at Point Pleasant, was said to be unwilling to fight against the Americans again or to become embroiled in the growing conflict between Britain and the colonies. He led many of the Thawakilla band south, where they joined other Shawnees living among the creeks. They later returned to the banks of the Ohio and there moved again. When the American Revolution broke out, Indians in the Ohio country understood that it was a war over Indian land as well as a war for independence. They heeded British warnings that the Americans intended to take their country and destroy them. Their best chance lay in siding with the British, who had offered at least token protection for Indian lands, rather than with the Americans, who were clearly hell-bent on stealing their lands. Shawnee chiefs told the Virginians in July 1775, "We were often inclined to believe there is no resting place for us, and that your intentions were to deprive us entirely of our whole country." At first, like most Indian nations, they hoped to stay out of the conflict they regarded as a British Civil War. Located between the frontiers of Virginia and Kentucky on the one hand, and the British and their Indian allies closer to Detroit on the others, the Shawnees were in a hard place. Reports that summer said they were constantly debating the war, but divided about what course to follow. At a treaty with the Continental Congress at Fort Pitt in the fall, Shawnee chiefs joined Wyandots, Delawares, and Senecas in agreeing to remain neutral. Yet in April 1776, a Shawnee chief accompanied a delegation of 14 northern Indians who traveled to Cherokee country to incite them to war. British Indian agent Henry Stewart was in the Cherokee town of Chota. When they arrived, painted black, they made a dramatic entry. They had traveled 70 days to get there through country that used to be Shawnee and Delaware hunting grounds, but was now thickly inhabited and the people all in arms. The delegates argued their cause in the council house. The Shawnee deputy was the last to speak. He produced a 9-foot purple wampum belt painted red as a sign of war. He recited the grievances of the Shawnees and other nations, particularly their cruel treatment at the hands of the Virginians. The Shawnees had once possessed lands stretching almost to the Atlantic Ocean, and the Indians once held the whole country. Now they barely had enough ground to stand on. "Better to die like men than to dwindle away by inches," he declared. The older Cherokee chiefs, who had seen war and tasted defeat, sat silent, but the warriors, led by a young chief named Dragon Canoe, accepted the Shawnee war belt. Dragon Canoe! It proved to be a disastrous step. Cherokee war parties attacked the settlers who encroached on their lands, but armies from Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas immediately retaliated, burned Cherokee villages and crops, and then dictated peace terms. Rather than surrender, Dragon Canoe led his warriors deep in the present-day Tennessee and continued to fight from the Chickamauga River and Lookout Mountain. Militant Shawnees and Chickamauga Cherokees made common cause. In July 1776, a war party of 2 Cherokees and 3 Shawnees captured Jemima, the daughter of Daniel Boone. It was a Sunday afternoon, and tired of being confined in Boonesboro, she and 2 other teenage girls took a canoe out in the river. The Indians seized them and set off for the Shawnee villages in the Ohio country. When the alarm was raised, Boone and other pioneers immediately gave chase. So this is, they killed 2 of Daniel Boone's sons, and now they're kidnapping his daughter. You would think Daniel Boone would get the picture that the Shawnee do not want them in Kentucky. So Ben chases them and then rescues them. 2 of the Indians were wounded and they fled. Jemima said that the Indians were kind to us, and it was inspired the Last of the Mohicans. So it inspired that movie. In the meetings with George Morgan, the American Indian agent at Fort Pitt, Chief Cornstalk and other Shawnee chiefs asserted that their people intended to remain neutral and preserve their friendship with the white people. Admittedly, some young men had already raised their hatchets, but Chief Cornstalk said that they were fools who had been misled by the Mingos and other troublemakers. Chief Pluggy was a Mingo. John Logan was a Mingo. He told we Penachuktha, also known as the White Deer, which was a Shawnee's name for Morgan, George Morgan. All of our old wise chiefs are dead, and we look on ourselves but as boys in wisdom. But when they spoke with him, the dark clouds dispelled, and they could see things clearly. More than 600 Indians showed up at the Treaty of Fort Pitt that fall and confirmed that the Ohio River is the boundary of their lands.